Tucked away in the Boston Public Library, amongst a stack of other decades-old newspapers, lay a new answer to an old historical question. How did the Underground Railroad get its name? Former New York Times reporter Scott Shane found it while digging through the archives for his new book about abolitionist and writer Thomas Smallwood, called Flee North, A Forgotten Hero and the Fight for Freedom in Slavery's Borderland. To dig into what he learned, Scott Shane joins me now, as does Lemerche Frazier, an artist, educator, historian, and the former director of education and interpretation at the Museum of African American History. Thank you both so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Pleasure.
Thank you for inviting us. Yes.
So, Scott, can we start with you? Can you set the scene for us about this warehouse at the Boston Public Library? You're digging through, looking for records. What did you find?
So, actually, this was all during the pandemic in 2020. And the Boston Public Library was shut down. I started contacting people there, and eventually they reported to me that they'd found these newspapers in a warehouse and were thinking about doing something with them. And then after several months of back and forth, I got word that they had microfilmed the whole collection, the whole stack. And I went down to the library and downloaded them all on a thumb drive and read them very carefully. And so Thomas Smallwood was born in slavery outside Washington, D.C. He basically educated himself. He bought his freedom, and he started organizing mass escapes in the 1840s from slavery. And not only that, but he was sending off these newspaper dispatches to an abolitionist paper in Albany, New York. And it was in those newspaper dispatches that I discovered this story about how the Underground Railroad got its name.
So it was an article from August 10th, 1842, right, in the publication The Tocsin of Liberty. And he said, "It was your cruelty to him that made him disappear by the same Underground Railroad or steam balloon about which one of your city constables was swearing so bitterly a few weeks ago." Is that the first ever reference to this as the Underground Railroad?
Yes, as far as I can tell, that's the first reference in print. You know, there are these big 19th century newspaper databases now. Everything's been digitized. And if you go and put that phrase, Underground Railroad, into these databases, all of the early references come from Thomas Smallwood. At first, he's just quoting a police constable who was expressing his frustration. All these people were escaping, and this police constable earned a lot of money on the side from catching runaways and returning them and collecting the money, the rewards. He was saying they must be getting away on an Underground Railroad. Of course, there was no Underground Railroad in the 1840s. So he was essentially saying they must be kidnapped by aliens. I don't know how they're getting away. And Smallwood thought this was great. This was a compliment to him. And he started riffing on these newspaper dispatches, which he wrote under a pseudonym because everything he was doing was, of course, very risky and highly illegal. And he said he pronounced himself the general agent of all the branches of the Underground Railroad. He would, with mock sympathy, advise slaveholders to report to the office of the Underground Railroad in Washington for further information about where their servants may have fled. And so he had a grand time. And as it turns out, over the next year or two, other newspapers began to pick up that language. And that's why we call the whole system of organized escapes the Underground Railroad today.
I never appreciated before that the term Underground Railroad essentially started as a joke at slaveholders' expense.
Yes, and sort of a joke with an edge. I mean, these dispatches, which he wrote under a pseudonym he took from Charles Dickens, are written in a kind of high satirical style, and their purpose is basically to mock the slaveholders, mock the slave catchers, and celebrate the people who are making their escape. And so for him, the idea of this mythical system that is somehow transporting people to the North was just a great big joke on the slave society.
And Lemerche, here in Boston, particularly in Beacon Hill, I think, right, we have a rich history of the Underground Railroad. Can you take us through what we have here locally that's sort of hiding in plain sight, this history that's all around us?
I want to highlight that it was Sue Bailey Thurman, who was an archivist from Los Angeles, who under her living and residence here with her husband, Howard Bailey Thurman, as a historian, she began to recognize these places and spaces of real note and are treasures like the African Meeting House and the A.B.L. Smith School. As she created this Negro Freedom Trail, she was giving onus to the sites along what would have been Underground Railroad activity. And when we talk about this Underground Railroad activity, as we review what is now a registered trademark of the Museum of African American History in 14 sites, it is always expanding because history is not static. In looking at those sites that she cited, we find a network of people, places, events, of safekeeping, of the clandestine nature of what had to be a necessary underneath the everyday activity organization of people providing safety, providing the opportunity to rebuild their lives as they arrive here. But we also know that the people who were here in the Vigilance Committee and the abolitionists were in a network nationwide. We're in a space of people who would be traveling north, people who would be traveling west, people who would be traveling south as routes of this hidden pathway as they were arcing out their freedom, beginning to understand the cost of liberty, and by any means necessary, whether it was on the real railroad, whether it was in carriages, whether they were walking, that this is what a reality of having to keep that information contained. Mm-hmm. And so this idea that there is the Industrial Revolution that is bringing forth the steam engine, the wheels that are turning, we get this real railroad that is sporadic in its layout. In Beacon Hill, we can talk about the places that are, by the structure of Beacon Hill, hidden away from the main roads. If you go into Beacon Hill, you will find that it was a perfect site for underground, what is called Underground Railroad activity, because there were alleyways. It is structured so that you could protect people in spaces like a space named Holmes Alley, right, that you cannot see from the main Joy Street, or you couldn't see from Anderson Street or Russell Street. That the way it is structured, it is now deemed as one of the most plentiful spaces of Underground Railroad activity because of its structure and the nature of how it is laid out than any other place in the country.
Scott, you wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times that sort of the mythology that's been built around the Underground Railroad may be actually obscuring some of the reality of what happened, that, in fact, a lot of those who escaped from slavery did so on their own without any help. Can you speak about that, about sort of the mythology of the Underground Railroad compared to the reality of it?
Well, one of the things I found in researching this book is that, you know, the Underground Railroad became, over many decades, a sort of a kinder, gentler way for white Americans and black Americans to talk about slavery, the very sometimes brutal story of slavery, because there were white Americans and black Americans involved in helping people, free themselves. I think most historians would say that most people ran north, ran to freedom without a lot of help, and that many of the people, most of the people who were creating these networks and helping people escape were actually African American themselves, usually free African American. But I think, over the decades, there was an increasing sense that somehow this was something that white people did for black people. And I think that historians have pretty much put that myth to rest. In my research, I also deal with the domestic slave trade in Baltimore and Washington, which is where Smallwood was helping people escape. And many of them were escaping for fear that they were about to be sold south, possibly to the deep south, to the cotton plantations or the sugar plantations, and torn away from their families. And that was often the fear that would drive people to move, to try and run for it in the middle of the night. And one thing that strikes me is that we Americans know a whole lot more about the Underground Railroad, which includes the stories of some, good-hearted white people, and nothing about the domestic slave trade, which does not, alas, have any heartwarming stories about white people.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating subject and something we could talk about a whole lot longer. And I wish we had more time, but I'm so grateful to both of you for joining us to talk about this day. Scott Shane and Lemercy Fraser, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.